They fit in the palm of a hand, fragile shapes of lions, birds, and bears, carved tens of thousands of years ago by people whose names we will never know. Yet these figures carried more than beauty. They carried meaning. They were the first whispers of myth, silent messengers from a world where survival was harsh but imagination was boundless. Why did our ancestors shape animals so small, so carefully, when every moment of life demanded focus on survival? The answer may lie in the very birth of human storytelling. Archaeologists uncovering delicate figurines of mammoths, lions, horses, and birds from ancient caves and Ice Age camps do not see mere curiosities. They see the earliest fingerprints of imagination pressed into history, because these carvings, some stretching back more than 35,000 years, represent one of the most extraordinary leaps in human thought. The moment when our ancestors stopped responding only to the demands of survival and began to create symbols, to make objects that carried meaning far beyond their physical form. And when one considers the brutality of that world, endless winters that stripped the land of warmth, predators lurking in shadows, constant hunger, constant fear, the fact that people devoted precious time and skill to shaping ivory, bone and stone into tiny figures, tells us something profound about their inner lives. For no community struggling against cold and death would waste effort without purpose. And so every curve of mammoth ivory polished smooth, every delicate notch of a bird's wing carved into soft stone, every powerful outline of a lion etched by a flint blade, was not random decoration, but an act of belief. And when we look closer, we see that each animal chosen was not arbitrary either. It was charged with significance. The mammoth, massive and enduring, became more than food. It was a symbol of strength, survival, the embodiment of winter's challenge. The lion, terrifying and majestic, stood for ferocity, courage and danger, a spirit that hunters wished to capture and carry with them. The horse represented speed, migration, abundance, a bridge between movement and sustenance. And birds, so often carved with surprising delicacy, stood for freedom, cycles of seasons, the mystery of flight across horizons unknown. And to hold such a carving was to hold a story without words, a myth before myth had even been spoken, because in its silent shape was compressed an entire world view. And what makes this even more powerful is that these objects were not confined to one place or one group. They appeared across vast regions, from Vogelherd in Germany to Dolny Vestonitz in the Czech lands, to Siberian plains where frozen earth has preserved ivory untouched for millennia, a network of symbols stretching across continents, suggesting that despite distance and difference, humans everywhere carried the same impulse, to carve the animals that ruled their landscapes, to shrink the terrifying and awe-inspiring into something small, portable, touchable, and by doing so to master them not in body but in spirit. And in this act we see the birth of mythology, because mythology begins not with language but with imagination, with the recognition that the world is not only what is seen, but also what is felt, feared, revered. And these carvings are proof that humans had already begun to interpret their world symbolically, to give meaning where there was none, to link their survival to ideas larger than survival. And so we might picture a circle of firelight deep in an Ice Age cave, elders passing a carved lion from hand to hand, as stories of its roar and its dominance fill the air. Hunters rubbing smooth figurines for luck before leaving for the plains. Mothers showing children a bird carved from stone and explaining how it marks the change of seasons. And in each of these acts, the carving becomes more than an object. It becomes a vessel for memory, belief, and teaching. And when we remember that myth at its core is not just a story, but a way of making sense of the world, we see clearly that these carvings were the earliest myths. Myths without words, but alive in shape, in touch, in shared experience. And they mattered because survival alone is not enough. Humans needed belonging, humans needed meaning. And these small figures created both, serving as tokens of identity, markers of community, proof that life was not only a struggle against nature, but also a participation in something greater, something unseen. And this is why across cultures and times, despite distance, the same animals reappear, as if humanity carried within its very blood a shared lexicon of sacred symbols. And when later civilizations rose, lions still roared in myths of strength. Birds still flew as messengers between worlds. Mammoths transformed into elephants of wisdom and endurance. And the small figurines of Ice Age hunters became the statues, icons, and gods of later ages. But all of it, every temple, every legend, every story of gods in animal forms, traces back to the moment when someone, somewhere, took a sharp flint blade and began to carve, not out of necessity but out of vision, carving not just an animal but a myth, and in that act declaring that humans are not defined only by hunger or fear, but by imagination. And so when modern hands lift these fragile objects from the soil, cracked but enduring, smoothed by time yet still clear in detail, we are not looking at artifacts. We are looking at the first expressions of what it meant to be human. We are staring into the silent birth of storytelling, the first sparks of myth glowing in ivory and stone. And they remind us that even at the dawn of history, humanity was already reaching for something more than survival, reaching for meaning, reaching for story. And in these tiny carved animals, silent for 35,000 years, the very first myths of humanity still breathe. If the tiny carved animals were only about skill, they would still impress us, but their true power is revealed when we ask why they mattered so deeply. Because in carving symbols, humans crossed a boundary no other creature has ever crossed. The boundary between reacting to the world and reshaping it in the imagination. And this boundary is visible in the way these figurines were not only created but also used. For traces of wear on their surfaces suggest they were handled often, passed from palm to palm until ivory was polished smooth by touch, which tells us they were not hidden away but active in the daily and spiritual lives of those who made them. And the evidence of deliberate placement in caves hints at ritual, as though people left them as offerings to unseen forces, marking spaces with meaning that extended beyond the physical. And this act of imbuing an object with sacred power is what gives rise to myth, because myth is not just a tale told. It is a belief embodied, a way of turning fear into story, story into tradition, and tradition into identity. And in those long winters when darkness dominated, the figurines glowed in firelight like companions of the spirit, objects that kept memory alive and transformed the dangers outside into manageable shapes inside. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of these figures is their universality, because they appear across vast distances, in regions that could never have communicated directly, which suggests that humans everywhere carried within them the same need to shrink the overwhelming into the small, to transform chaos into symbol, to give shape to the invisible forces of nature. And here we see the emergence of archetypes, those timeless forms that Carl Jung would later describe, for the lion as courage, the bird as messenger, the mammoth as endurance. These are not random associations, but universal echoes that began in the Ice Age and still reverberate in the stories we tell today. And when we see these echoes, we recognize that mythology is not an invention of civilization, but a birthright of humanity, as ancient as breath itself. And the figurines are the earliest surviving evidence of that birthright, each one a seed of myth that grew into forests of legend. But to appreciate their full significance, we must also consider the environment in which they were made, a world locked in cycles of ice and thaw, where glaciers carved landscapes and herds of mammoths thundered across plains, where predators like cave lions and hyenas stalked, and where humans themselves were a fragile minority clinging to survival. And in such a world, the animals were not distant subjects. They were constant presences, sources of food, danger, and awe. And to carve them was to both honor and control them, to say with hands what could not yet be said with words. And in this way, carving became a ritual of power, a means of engaging with forces too vast to ignore. And this same impulse still shapes us, for we continue to make symbols of what matters most. Only now they are flags, statues, icons, but the essence is unchanged. And the continuity between those Ice Age figurines and modern culture is staggering, because it reminds us that while tools and technologies evolve, the human need for myth remains eternal. And in fact, it may be the very thing that allowed humans to outlast their rivals, because Neanderthals too carved, but rarely with the same symbolic richness. And while they survived for hundreds of thousands of years, they did not build the same complex traditions of belief. And perhaps it was myth, the power of shared story embodied in shared symbols, that allowed our ancestors to unite, to pass knowledge across generations, to create a continuity stronger than any single life. And so when we look at these figurines, we are not just seeing art, we are seeing the survival strategy that changed everything. For weapons and fire may have kept bodies alive, but myth kept groups alive. Myth created cohesion, and cohesion carried humanity forward. And this is why the figurines matter, because in them lies the first evidence that humans understood. Survival is not only physical, but also cultural, not only about food and shelter, but about meaning, belonging and belief, and every worn edge of ivory, every smooth line of stone, every carved eye staring back across time reminds us that myth was born not in temples or books, but in the hands of people huddled against the cold, whispering stories to firelight, pressing symbols into bone and ivory so that something larger than themselves might endure. And it has endured because when we gaze upon these fragile carvings today, cracked yet unbroken, we feel the same awe their makers must have felt. And in that moment, the distance of 35,000 years collapses, and we realize that the tiny carved animals were never tiny at all. They were immense. They were the first great monuments of the mind, the first myths of humanity carved into permanence. To understand more deeply why these tiny figurines mattered so profoundly, we must look not only at the objects themselves, but at the human hands that shaped them. Hands calloused from hunting, gathering, and endless labor, yet capable of extraordinary delicacy when holding a shard of ivory against a flint tool, carving curves and lines with patience that seems almost impossible in a world where time was survival. And this contrast alone reveals something remarkable about our ancestors, that even amid hunger, cold, and danger, they made space for creativity, and in making space for creativity, they unlocked something larger than themselves. Because creativity is not only about producing beauty, it is about producing meaning. And meaning is what allows groups to endure beyond the immediate. So the figurines are not simply art. They are the earliest evidence of humans pausing to reflect, to symbolize, to give shape to thoughts invisible. And this capacity is what separates us from every other creature. For no lion carves another lion, no mammoth shapes another mammoth. But humans, fragile and vulnerable, shaped the very beings they both feared and revered, shrinking them into objects that could be owned, carried, given, and remembered. And in this ownership of symbol, humanity took a step toward owning the world itself. Because to reduce a mammoth to ivory in the palm was to prove that imagination could master what the body could not. And this act of symbolic control may have been the true beginning of culture, because once something can be represented, it can be shared. Once it can be shared, it can be remembered. And once it can be remembered, it can be passed on, not just through a single generation, but through many. And so a carving was not just a personal object. It was a bridge across time, a bridge across death, a voice carved into matter that could outlast its maker. And this endurance mattered in an age when lives were short and fragile. For to leave behind a carving was to leave behind a piece of oneself, a story carried forward, a whisper from one fire to the next. And when we consider the cumulative effect of this practice, we begin to see how entire traditions of myth could grow, how repeated symbols of lions, mammoths, horses, and birds could form a shared mental landscape, a framework of meaning that bound groups together, so that even if a story was forgotten, the figure remained to spark memory, to invite retelling. And in this we see not only the birth of myth, but the birth of continuity. The earliest form of culture passed by objects rather than words, and this continuity was a form of survival in itself, because knowledge embedded in symbol could carry across generations more reliably than spoken word alone. And in this way, figurines were the first books, the first libraries, small but potent repositories of meaning carved into bone and ivory. And as they traveled with groups migrating across landscapes, they carried ideas farther than any voice could reach, spreading symbols like seeds across continents. And perhaps this explains why similar figures appear in places far apart, because the ideas they embodied were carried not only in minds but in objects. And when we reflect on this, we realize that each figurine was a world in miniature, holding within it layers of survival knowledge, spiritual belief, and communal identity. And that is why they matter even now, because they show us that humans have always been more than toolmakers and hunters. We have always been storytellers and mythmakers, and our greatest strength has always been this capacity to create meaning together. And when you see a figurine cracked by time but still bearing its shape, you are not only seeing a piece of art, you are seeing the survival of an idea, a piece of myth that has lived longer than empires, longer than languages, longer than civilizations themselves, whispering to us across 35,000 years that the human story has never been only about flesh and bone, but about imagination, about the urge to make the unseen visible and the forgotten unforgettable. And this truth binds us still, because though we live in cities, hold books, and stream stories on glowing screens, the impulse is the same. We are still carving our world into symbols, still shrinking what is vast into what can be held, still telling myths in forms new and old. And the tiny carved animals of prehistory remind us that it was this impulse, more than any weapon or invention that made us human. If we step even deeper into the mystery of these tiny carved animals, what emerges is not only their role as symbols of myth and survival, but also their place as some of the earliest tools of imagination training, because holding them and contemplating them was a rehearsal for abstract thought, an exercise in seeing beyond what was visible, and this mental leap was as important as fire or stone tools in shaping the destiny of our species. For once, humans could treat an object as more than itself. Once they could see a carved mammoth as both ivory and spirit. They had crossed into a new dimension of consciousness. And this was not a small step, but a revolution of the mind. And perhaps this explains why these figurines often appear in caves and ritual spaces. Because caves themselves were liminal zones, thresholds between light and darkness, safety and danger, the known and the unknown. And when figurines were placed there, they occupied a space that was both real and symbolic, anchoring the imagination in a material form. And it is worth considering how this experience might have felt for a person carving by firelight, hearing the roar of wind outside, the crackle of flames within, tracing the curve of ivory into the likeness of an animal they feared and revered. They were not only recording the animal's shape, they were rehearsing its spirit, drawing it into presence, making it familiar, manageable, and this practice was a kind of meditation, a way of thinking through hands what could not yet be spoken. And this link between hands, imagination, and myth is perhaps the deepest thread in our evolution, because hands freed from climbing became instruments of making, and making became instruments of meaning, so that by carving animals, humans carved themselves into a new form. Creatures defined not just by survival, but by storytelling. And when groups gathered around fire to pass these figurines, to touch them, to tell their meanings, they were not only sharing stories, but synchronizing minds, aligning individual imaginations into a collective vision. And this synchronization is the essence of culture, the thing that allows strangers to act as kin, to cooperate beyond blood ties. And in that cooperation lay the seeds of everything to come, from tribes to nations to civilizations. So when we look at a small carved reindeer or a lion etched into ivory, we are seeing the first step in a chain that leads directly to the myths of Gilgamesh, the gods of Olympus, the symbols of modern religions, and even the brands and icons that dominate our world today. All are echoes of this first imaginative act, this decision to make meaning visible. And what is even more profound is that the fragility of these figurines, the fact that so many were lost, broken, or forgotten, makes the survivors even more powerful. Because they remind us that myth itself is fragile, always in need of retelling, always in danger of vanishing unless carried forward by hands and hearts. And yet the fact that we still hold them now, tens of thousands of years later, proves that myth, once born, can endure longer than the world that made it. And perhaps this is why they were treasured, why they were polished by touch and placed with care, because people knew even then that they were holding something larger than themselves, something that would outlast them. And this awareness may have been the earliest form of immortality, not the survival of the body, but the survival of the story. And in carving animals into ivory, people carved their own names into time, names we will never know, but whose voices we still hear in the silent language of form and symbol. And this recognition should humble us, because it shows that the distance between them and us is not as vast as it seems. We too carve, we too pass symbols, we too seek immortality through what we create. And the thread that runs from those Ice Age hands to our own is unbroken, proving that the human story has always been one of continuity, and that continuity was born in moments like these, when someone bent close to a fragment of ivory and turned it into myth. What becomes even more fascinating as we follow the trail of these carved creatures is how they reveal the beginnings of imagination, not just as a tool for survival, but as a way of negotiating the unseen. Because humans at that time lived in a world filled with forces they could not explain, storms that tore across plains, floods that drowned valleys, diseases that struck without warning, death that lurked in the simplest wound, and in the face of such uncertainty, the mind reached instinctively for patterns, for explanations, for stories that could tame chaos, and the figurines served as anchors in this search, material forms that gave weight to invisible powers, allowing people to carry protection, to hold hope, to embody memory. And here we see the transition from mere symbol to talisman, from representation to presence, because to the maker and the holder, the carved reindeer was not only an image of a reindeer, but the reindeer itself in some spiritual sense, a vessel of essence, and this belief in essence in the power of objects to hold forces larger than themselves, is the foundation of mythic thought, animism in its earliest form. The idea that everything has spirit, that the world is alive with presences, that nothing is inert. And in this worldview, the figurines were companions, allies, mediators between people and the powers they feared. And this practice of investing the world with spirit had profound consequences, because it shaped how people treated animals, landscapes, even each other, creating a moral and ritual framework that guided behavior. And though it may seem distant from us now, the truth is, we still live within it. Because even today, we invest objects with meaning far beyond their material. We treat flags as sacred, rings as vows, relics as divine. And these habits are not inventions of modern religion, but echoes of Ice Age carvings, proof that the way we see the world was established not in temples or palaces, but in the caves and camps of our ancestors. And what makes this even more extraordinary is that the figurines acted as bridges, not only to the unseen, but also to the unborn, to those who had not yet come, because when they were passed down, they carried memory, they preserved belief, they allowed continuity. And in this way, myth became not only a way of facing the present, but a way of preparing the future. A future where people already knew how to see meaning in stone and ivory, already knew how to treat objects as sacred, already knew how to shape reality with imagination. And this preparation may explain why, when agriculture arrived, when cities rose, when writing emerged, people were ready. Because the groundwork of symbolic thought had been laid millennia earlier in carvings small enough to fit in the palm. And if we pause to consider this, we realize that the figurines are not marginal curiosities of prehistory, but central milestones in human evolution. Milestones without which civilization itself would not have been possible. Because before law, before kings, before temples, before scripture, there were tiny carved animals teaching humans that symbols matter, that objects can hold stories, that imagination can give form to forces unseen. And it is this continuity that explains why, when we look at them now, cracked and fragile yet enduring, we still feel their pull. Because we too are creatures of myth, still seeking meaning, still carving symbols, still passing stories across the darkness of time. And though our world is filled with skyscrapers and satellites, the essence is unchanged. We are still descendants of those who sat by firelight, shaping ivory into spirit, and in those small acts carved not only animals, but humanity itself. As we continue along the thread, these tiny carvings weave across time. Another dimension of their significance becomes clear, and that is their role in shaping not only collective myth, but individual identity. Because when someone carved or carried such a figure, they were not simply engaging in group ritual, but also in personal reflection, holding in their hands a condensed form of their own fears, hopes, and desires. And this act of personalization was revolutionary, because it meant that myth was not only something inherited, but also something made, something that could be touched, altered, and embodied. And in this sense, the figurines were the first mirrors of the self, small enough to be carried, powerful enough to transform perception. And this personal connection to myth is part of what makes us human. For myth has always been both collective and intimate, both a shared language of meaning and a private well of identity. And when a hunter tucked a carved lion into a pouch, or a mother placed a tiny mammoth beside her child, they were creating a link between self and cosmos, between individual and world. And in this link, we see the origins of religion, art, and even psychology, because the figurines allowed people to externalize their inner world, to give shape to the invisible currents of thought and emotion, to make them tangible and therefore manageable. And this practice echoes through history, because we still create amulets, charms, keepsakes, portraits, and tokens that embody more than their material. We still invest objects with the power of memory and identity, and the fact that this impulse is universal, appearing in cultures across time and geography, tells us it is not accidental but fundamental, born with those first carvings in firelit caves. And what makes this recognition even more profound is that these figurines were often portable, designed to be carried through migrations, hunts, and journeys, which means they were companions as much as symbols, objects that traveled with people across landscapes, linking places with memory, binding individuals to communities, anchoring myth in mobility. And in this way, they may have been the first form of portable culture, a tradition that has never left us, for today. We still carry tokens, photos, and charms in our pockets, still wear jewelry that speaks of identity, still treasure objects that move with us as silent witnesses of our journeys, And when we see this continuity, it becomes clear that the figurines were not only about animals or myths, but about the shaping of the human condition itself, the forging of a relationship between self and symbol that would define every culture to come. And it is humbling to realize that the seeds of this relationship were planted not in grand temples or written texts, but in tiny carvings no larger than a hand. Carvings that remind us that the greatest revolutions of the mind often begin in the smallest of forms, and that the true legacy of humanity lies not only in the vast monuments we built later, but in the fragile objects that first taught us how to give shape to meaning, carry it with us, and let it define who we are. The deeper we follow these small carved beings through the corridors of prehistory, the more we realize that they were not only mirrors of the self or symbols of myth, but also bridges across generations, because their endurance allowed knowledge to leap from one life to another. And this bridging is what turned fragile survival into lasting culture. For in a world where most stories would die with their tellers, the figurines preserved fragments of meaning, carrying them like seeds into new contexts, and each time they were rediscovered, retold, or reinterpreted, they grew into something more, which is why we find continuity between the animals carved in Ice Age Europe and the sacred creatures that populate mythologies across continents, as though the essence of myth was not invented once, but continuously renewed by symbols that endured beyond their makers. And this continuity is what makes these figurines so powerful, because they represent the first physical archive of imagination, the earliest attempt to inscribe meaning into matter so that it could survive the silence of death and the erosion of memory. And when we see them this way, we realize they were more than art. They were messages, letters sent into the future, voices carved into ivory with the hope that someone, anyone, would remember. And this impulse to leave behind something lasting is one of the deepest traits of humanity, found in cave paintings, stone monuments, books, and digital records, all of which echo the same longing to defeat time, to remain present in a world that forgets. And when we recognize this, the figurines become more than prehistoric curiosities. They become the earliest chapter of our struggle with mortality, our refusal to vanish without trace, our insistence that meaning can be carved into permanence. And what is extraordinary is that these objects succeeded because they still speak to us now, their small shapes carrying the voices of lives long ended, reminding us that though flesh fades, story endures, and in this endurance lies the power of myth. For myth is never only about gods and spirits, it is about memory, the persistence of identity across the abyss of time. And when groups gathered to hold these carvings, to pass them from one hand to another, they were practicing a ritual of continuity, a rehearsal of culture, and perhaps even a rehearsal of history itself. For history is nothing more than the preservation of memory, and memory itself begins in symbols like these, fragile yet enduring, humble yet infinite. And when we touch them today in museums and collections, separated by glass but not by imagination, we too are part of that chain, inheritors of the first archive, guardians of the first myths, participants in a conversation that began 35,000 years ago and has never truly stopped, only changed its form. And in recognizing this, we see that our task is not only to study these carvings, but to understand what they say about us, about our refusal to let time erase meaning, about our need to remember and be remembered. And in this way, the tiny carved animals remind us that the oldest human story is not of conquest or invention, but of memory made solid, myth made permanent, the eternal defiance of forgetting. As we carry these figurines further into our exploration, another profound truth emerges, that they were not only symbols of myth, identity, and memory, but also instruments of teaching, tools that allowed knowledge to be transferred without words. For when a child held a carved mammoth or lion, they were holding more than ivory. They were touching an embodied lesson about the world, a silent teacher that communicated reverence, caution, admiration, and awe. And this transmission was crucial in a time when survival depended on understanding the animals, the landscape, and the forces of nature. So these carvings acted as mnemonic devices, compact symbols that condensed entire experiences into forms small enough for a hand. And in this way, they allowed children to learn not just through direct danger, but through imagination, to internalize the power of a mammoth without standing before its tusks, to absorb the significance of a lion without facing its fangs. And in doing so, they provided one of the earliest forms of symbolic education, the beginning of storytelling as teaching. And this role explains why the figurines were so carefully shaped, because they were not random doodles but deliberate forms meant to endure, to be understood, to be passed from elder to youth, from parent to child. And this practice connects directly to how culture itself is transmitted. For culture is nothing but the stories we tell to the young. And here, in the firelit hands of a child clutching an ivory carving, we see the origins of that tradition. The first classrooms not of walls but of circles around a flame. The first textbooks not of parchment but of bone and stone. The first lessons not of written words but of symbols carved into permanence. And this is why figurines resonate so deeply with us even now, because they remind us that education itself, the passing of knowledge across time, was born not in cities or schools but in camps where survival demanded memory, where imagination made memory possible, and where memory, once embodied in object, could become tradition. And in this, we glimpse the earliest threads of continuity that would later become mythologies, religions, philosophies, and sciences, all rooted in the same impulse to preserve meaning for those not yet born. And the figurines are perhaps the purest expression of this impulse, stripped of complexity, carrying only form and symbol, yet powerful enough to ignite imagination across generations. And it is staggering to realize that what we call education today, with its vast institutions and libraries, is only an elaboration of what was happening when a small carved reindeer was passed to a child as both a toy and a lesson, a bridge between innocence and survival, between ignorance and knowledge. And in this way, the figurines are not only the first myths, but also the first classrooms, the first syllables of culture spoken not with voice, but with ivory. And their endurance into our present proves that the desire to teach, to remember, to carry wisdom forward, is as ancient as humanity itself. A fire that has never gone out, only changed its form. And when we touch these figurines today, we are not only witnessing art, or myth, or memory, we are standing inside the first school, still glowing with the firelight of a world long vanished, yet alive in us, because we too continue the same work, shaping symbols, passing them forward, teaching our children the stories that will outlast us, exactly as our ancestors once did with their tiny carved animals. As we near the end of this journey into the world of tiny carved animals, a striking realization rises to the surface, that these objects were not only carriers of myth, memory, and teaching, but also the first instruments of connection between humans and the cosmos. Because through them, people began to imagine their place in a universe filled with forces beyond comprehension. And this step was monumental, for it transformed existence from a mere struggle for survival into a quest for meaning. And the figurines were the first compasses pointing toward that quest, embodying the idea that life was not random but ordered, that animals were not only prey or predator, but part of a larger cycle, a pattern, a story that humans could enter by shaping it into symbol. And this awareness was revolutionary, because once people believed the world had patterns, they could imagine themselves within those patterns, no longer drifting in chaos but walking within myth. And in that walk they found dignity, identity, and purpose. And this sense of belonging to something greater is what gave them resilience. For myth turned fear into narrative and narrative into courage. And the figurines were the physical touchstones of that transformation, held in hands as reminders that the universe was alive with meaning, that survival was more than luck, that existence itself was sacred. And in this way, these carvings were the earliest shrines, portable temples small enough to be, carried yet powerful enough to root entire communities in belief. And it is staggering to realize that from these humble beginnings would grow the colossal mythologies of later civilizations. The pyramids, the ziggurats, the temples, the cathedrals, all echoes of this first impulse to carve the sacred into matter, to give form to the formless. And what is even more humbling is that these figurines prove that spirituality did not begin with kings or priests, but with ordinary people. Anonymous hands shaping ivory in the glow of firelight. And this democratization of the sacred is perhaps their greatest legacy. For they remind us that myth was born not in the palaces of power, but in the hearts of families, in the gatherings of tribes, in the shared silence of awe before nature's immensity. And this truth still resonates, because though our myths have grown vast and complex, the core remains the same, the search for connection with forces larger than ourselves, the need to belong to a universe of meaning, the desire to transcend mortality through story. And when we see these carvings today, cracked yet enduring, we see ourselves reflected in them, because we too continue the same quest, still carving symbols, still building shrines, still telling stories that transform fear into meaning, And this continuity across tens of thousands of years is perhaps the most powerful story of all, that humanity has never stopped carving, never stopped believing, never stopped seeking the sacred in the shapes of the world. And it all began with tiny animals shaped by hands long turned to dust, but whose vision still burns within us. And so, standing at the threshold of this vast journey into the heart of prehistory, we return to the tiny carved animals not as curiosities but as revelations. For they are among the oldest surviving fragments of the human mind made visible. The earliest proof that our species refused to accept life as nothing but hunger, fear, and death, and instead reached into imagination to wrestle with mystery, to find patterns where none seemed clear, to give meaning to forces that could crush us, to transform overwhelming nature into stories. And it is this transformation that marks the birth of humanity as something more than animal. Because while we hunted and gathered like other creatures, while we feared predators and fought for survival, only we carved ivory into myth. Only we pressed spirit into symbol. Only we found ways to make memory last beyond the frail span of flesh. And every fragment of mammoth ivory still bearing the outline of lion or horse or reindeer is a witness to that moment, a testimony carved not for us, but carried forward to us across 35 millennia, carrying the voices of people who lived and died before our nations, before our languages, before our histories, yet whose thoughts, fears, and dreams survive in the silent weight of carved forms. And when we look at them, we are confronted with the astonishing fact that these people, so distant in time, were not primitive shadows, but the first visionaries, the first storytellers, the first teachers of meaning, whose tools were fire, flint, and ivory, and yet whose impact still burns in us. Because without them, there would be no myth, no religion, no art, no philosophy, no science, nothing that makes us more than mere survival machines. And this realization should shake us, because it reveals that the true birth of culture is not measured in metal or stone, not in kings or empires, but in moments of quiet creativity, when an anonymous hand carved an animal by firelight, and in that act created a bridge between self and cosmos, between present and future, between fear and hope. And this bridge has never collapsed. It stretches unbroken through time, carrying stories that became gods, gods that became civilizations, civilizations that became the modern world, and yet all of it rests on the same impulse: to imagine, to believe, to carve meaning into permanence. And this is why these figurines matter more than any monument, because monuments crumble but the impulse to make them endures. And that impulse began here, in carving so small they could be hidden in a hand, yet so powerful they contained the seeds of every myth we know. And perhaps the greatest wonder of all is that their makers knew, on some instinctive level, that they were carving more than decoration, because the wear on their surfaces shows they were held, cherished, passed, treasured, not abandoned as mere tools, but revered as companions of spirit. And in this reverence we see the first rituals, the first philosophies, the first religions, and we are reminded that the sacred did not begin in temples or texts, but in the imagination of people who looked at the world and refused to see it as empty, who filled it instead with stories, with spirits, with gods waiting to be born. And in this refusal we find the true essence of humanity. For animals survive by instinct, but humans survive by meaning, and it is meaning that carried us through ice and darkness, meaning that bound groups together, meaning that gave us courage to hunt beasts larger than us, meaning that gave us reason to endure when death was everywhere. And the figurines were the first vessels of that meaning, fragile yet enduring, and so they are not only our oldest art, but our oldest companions, witnesses to every step of the story we have walked since, silent but unyielding, waiting in caves and graves for millennia until rediscovered, still whispering across time that myth is eternal. That imagination is the true fire of humanity. That story is stronger than death. And as we hold them now, under glass in museums, studied by scholars, admired by millions, we are not only looking back but also looking forward, because they remind us that the story they began is not finished, that we are still carving, still imagining, still seeking the sacred in symbols, still building bridges of meaning across the abyss of time. And in this realization, we understand that the true legacy of the tiny carved animals is not their survival, but ours. Not their endurance, but the endurance of imagination itself. For as long as we continue to tell stories, to create symbols, to shape meaning into matter, we remain connected to those anonymous ancestors who first carved ivory into myth. And so the circle is unbroken, and we, like them, stand in darkness illuminated by the glow of imagination, carving the invisible into the visible, defying the silence with story, proving again and again that to be human is to carve, to believe, to remember, to endure. But the story does not end even here, because the tiny carved animals still echo in ways we often fail to see, their presence lingering like shadows in the very fabric of our modern lives. Because every culture that followed carried forward the same impulse, reshaping it into new forms, building gods from animals, weaving constellations from creatures, filling temples with statues that were nothing more than the descendants of those first carvings. And though we may believe ourselves far removed from the firelit caves of the Ice Age, in truth we are not. For when we place a photograph in a locket, when we keep a small figurine on our desk, when we treasure a childhood toy or a piece of jewelry, not for its material worth, but for the meaning it carries, we are doing what our ancestors did, investing small objects with power that transcends their shape, transforming matter into memory, presence, and myth. And this continuity across 40,000 years should not surprise us, because myth is not something ancient and finished, but something eternal and living, always reborn in new guises, always adapting to the needs of each age. And if those ancient people carved animals to confront survival, we carve symbols today to confront uncertainty, to give ourselves courage in a world no less fragile. For though we have technology and cities and science, we are still human, still mortal, still creatures of fear and longing, still in need of meaning larger than ourselves. And this is why myth endures, why figurines endure, why symbols endure. Because they answer the one question that has never changed. How do we live knowing we will die? How do we find courage in a world that can break us? How do we leave behind something that will last when we are gone? And the tiny carved animals were the first answer to that question, the first defiance of silence, and perhaps also the most honest. For they did not promise salvation or eternity, only connection, only continuity, only the reassurance that as long as the carving was held, the story was alive, the spirit was near, the group was bound, and maybe this is what we still seek. Not certainty, but connection. Not permanence, but presence. Not immortality, but remembrance. And so we keep carving, keep creating, keep telling stories. And in this act, we prove that humanity is not defined by technology, wealth, or conquest, but by imagination, by our refusal to let existence remain mute, by our insistence that meaning must be made even from the smallest of forms. And this truth, carried by carvings the size of a palm, is a truth that will endure as long as we endure. For even if our cities fall, even if our monuments crumble, even if our technologies fade, as long as a human hand somewhere shapes an object to carry a story, the flame lit by those first carved animals will never die. And that is why their story is not only ancient but eternal, still unfolding in us, still calling us to remember, to imagine, to carve, to believe. And yet, even after all that has been said, the journey of the tiny carved animals does not rest in the past, or even in the present, because their meaning stretches into the future, a reminder not only of where we came from, but of where we might go. For if these figurines were the first bridges of imagination, then we must ask what bridges we are building today, what symbols we are carving into the fabric of our time, and what myths will endure long after we are gone. And in this question lies the deepest power of these carvings, because they remind us that the objects we create now, the images we project, the digital icons we design, the cultural stories we tell, are all part of the same continuum of meaning that began with a mammoth ivory horse or a lion carved in shadow. And whether we know it or not, we too are carving for the future, shaping how those who come after us will understand us. Just as we look back to these carvings to understand the first dreamers. And this realization is both humbling and urgent, because it means that the responsibility of imagination is never light, that every story we tell adds a stone to the road humanity will walk, that every myth we create will one day be inherited, carried, perhaps misunderstood, but never without weight. And if the first myths helped our ancestors survive ice and fear, what myths are we creating to help us survive our age of chaos, uncertainty, and change? What small symbols do we offer to give courage, connection, and hope? Because it may well be that the future will remember us not for our machines or monuments, but for the stories we leave behind, the myths that grow from our time. And in this sense, the figurines are both a mirror and a warning, showing us how fragile yet enduring symbols can be, how something the size of a fist can outlast empires, how meaning once carved can echo longer than power. And so we are called to reflect on what we are carving now, whether we know it or not, because myth is not optional for humanity. It is the marrow of our existence, and if we neglect it, we risk leaving behind a silence that no monument can fill. And yet the figurines remind us too that even the smallest effort can be enough. That meaning does not require grandeur but only sincerity. That a simple carved reindeer can speak across millennia. That a tiny lion can carry the weight of awe. That a fragile mammoth can bear the hopes of generations. And this truth should give us hope, because it tells us that the future does not demand perfection, but participation. That as long as we keep carving, keep imagining, keep shaping symbols of connection, the thread remains unbroken, the fire remains lit, the story continues. And in this way, the tiny carved animals are not only our past, but our guide, reminding us that myth must never end, that the act of giving shape to meaning is the act of being human, that the future belongs to those who refuse silence, who carve, who believe, who tell the story forward. If the first carved animals were born as myths of survival, shaped to bind human and beast into a story that transformed terror into meaning, then what we are living through now is another chapter of the same eternal process. For we too are carving myths, though our tools are no longer flint and ivory, but circuits, code, glass and light. And every glowing screen, every digital icon, every avatar crafted in the shifting landscapes of virtual worlds is a descendant of that ancient impulse to give form to the unseen, to carry meaning in a symbol, to transform the incomprehensible into something touchable. And it is important to understand that this is not merely technology, but mythology unfolding before our eyes. Because just as our ancestors once carved lions and mammoths to embody forces larger than themselves, we carve algorithms, artificial intelligences, and planetary dreams to embody the forces we now face. Forces of knowledge so vast they dwarf us, forces of uncertainty so great they terrify us, forces of possibility so immense they promise transcendence. And in all of these, we see the same instinct: to tell stories, to place ourselves within the chaos, to bridge the abyss between human fragility and the vast unknown. And perhaps one day archaeologists of the far future, or even beings not of Earth, will find traces of the myths we are now carving, fragments of our digital cultures stored on ancient servers, symbols etched into drifting satellites, stories inscribed in the archives we send into space. And they too will ask why we made them, what fears we faced, what stories gave us courage to move forward. And in that question, they will discover the same truth we see in the ivory lion and the mammoth figurine, that humanity has always been defined not by tools or weapons, but by imagination, by the refusal to let the unknown remain mute, by the insistence that everything larger than us must also be part of us, if only through story. And so the figurines are not only relics but prophecies, for they tell us that this act of carving meaning will never end, only change its form, and the continuity is staggering. Because when a hand struck ivory to carve a horse 35,000 years ago, it set in motion the same current that flows through our design of spacecraft, our creation of digital mythologies, our search for extraterrestrial life, our construction of artificial intelligences that mirror us like gods made of code. And in all of these, we are carving the sacred with new tools, turning the incomprehensible into the imaginable, and carrying forward the fire our ancestors first lit in the caves. And if we look carefully, we can see how each age of humanity carved its myths into what it feared most and hoped most, carving animals when nature was overwhelming, carving gods when mortality was overwhelming, carving machines when knowledge became overwhelming, and in the future, perhaps we will carve myths into the very fabric of stars, leaving behind constellations of meaning in the skies of other planets, symbols that will speak for us long after our voices are gone. Because myth is not bound to bone or ivory or digital code. Myth is bound only to the human need for meaning, and as long as that need endures, we will continue to carve, to tell, to remember, and in this way, the tiny carved animals are not simply echoes of the past, but living ancestors of the future, whispering that what matters most is not how we carve, but that we carve at all, that we continue to create symbols that outlast us, that we leave behind a thread for others to follow. And so the story of the tiny animals becomes the story of us all, not finished, not frozen in museums, but alive in every myth we create today. Alive in every digital carving, every technological symbol, every dream of the stars. And this story will continue long after us, because as long as humanity exists somewhere, someone will always be carving the invisible into the visible, the unknown into the known, the silence into story, proving again and again that to be human is to carve, and to carve is to endure. One day, long after we are gone and our cities have fallen silent, long after our monuments have weathered away, and the technologies we worshipped have collapsed into fragments, there will come another people, whether they are the descendants of our children, or beings who rise after us, or even travelers from distant stars. And they will sift through the remains of our world, and they will ask the same questions we now ask of the tiny carved animals. Questions of who we were, what we believed, what stories we carried through the storm of existence. And in that search, they will not find our governments, or our wars, or the passing fashions of our moment, for those things crumble quickly. But they will find our symbols, our carvings, our myths etched into whatever survives. And in those symbols they will see what mattered most to us, just as we see in the ivory lions and mammoths the things that mattered most to our ancestors. And perhaps they will hold a cracked screen like we hold a fragment of ivory, or decipher the strange remnants of code like we decipher the grooves of flint-carved figures, or stumble upon satellites drifting in silence and see them as shrines in the sky, wondering why we launched them, what we feared, what we longed for. And though they may not understand every detail of our languages or our rituals, they will understand the impulse behind them, because that impulse is the same that has bound humanity across every age. The need to carve meaning into matter, to refuse silence, to anchor ourselves against the abyss. And in that recognition, the future will see themselves in us, just as we see ourselves in the carvers of the Ice Age. And this collapse of time will remind them as it reminds us. That myth is not tied to an era, but to the condition of being human. And so when they gaze back at us across centuries or millennia, they will not see strangers but kin, fellow dreamers, fellow storytellers, fellow creators of symbols. And we will live again in their imagination, not as the broken ruins of a lost civilization, but as voices carried forward in carvings, digital or physical, fragile yet enduring, whispering of who we were, what we loved, what we feared. And in that whisper, they will hear what we hear when we look at the mammoth figurines. The eternal declaration that life cannot be reduced to survival alone, that existence demands story, and that meaning is the truest inheritance of our kind. And perhaps this is why the tiny carved animals strike us so powerfully, because they show us not only the roots of myth, but also its future, not only what has been, but what will be. And if we let ourselves see deeply, we realize that we are not only studying them, but participating in the same endless circle, carving myths that future eyes will one day study, continuing a chain of imagination that began in the dark of caves and will not end even when our world does. And in this awareness lies a kind of immortality, not for us as individuals, but for us as a species of carvers, a species whose essence is to shape the invisible into the visible, to make memory out of matter, to turn silence into story. And so the question is not whether we will be remembered, for we surely will, but what myths we are leaving behind, what symbols will speak when we can no longer speak, what carvings will carry forward the fire we inherited. And this question is urgent, because one day we will be nothing but the fragments we leave, and in those fragments the future will decide who we were. And just as we judge the Ice Age people by their tiny animals, we too will be judged by our carvings, by the myths we dared to shape, by the symbols we entrusted to endure. And if we are wise, we will carve them with care, for they are our only true voice across time, our only bridge into eternity. When we look at the tiny carved animals, it is easy to think of them as fragile relics of the past, delicate bones and ivory frozen in time. But in truth, they are not frozen. They are alive. They are still moving, because every time a pair of human eyes rests upon them and wonders why they were made, the story continues, the gesture of carving continues. And if that gesture has carried humanity from the shadowed mouth of a cave to the crowded noise of cities, from the intimate circle of a fire to the infinite reach of satellites, from myths whispered in darkness to archives encoded in light, then there is no reason to believe that it ends here, because the same impulse that pressed blade against ivory still presses circuits into silicon, and etches data into crystals, and sends messages out into the stars. And so the figurines are not simply artifacts. They are omens, signs of what is inevitable. That myth does not stay bound to earth. That the carving of meaning will not stop at soil and sky, but will leap outward, into the silence between worlds, into the vast darkness where nothing yet speaks. And already we have seen it begin, in the golden records carried by Voyager. engraved with music and greetings and images, a mythic capsule of our kind set adrift like a modern figurine into the void. And in the metal plates that map our solar system, in the satellites drifting endlessly above us like silver shrines, in the archives encoded into long-lasting alloys and crystals, in the messages we beam outward on radio waves, each one a carving, each one a declaration of who we are, what we value, what we dream, and what we fear. And these things will last far longer than us. They will survive the fall of nations, the erasure of languages, the collapse of our fragile technologies. For myth is not measured by durability of material, but by durability of meaning. And once carved, meaning has a strange persistence, leaping from hand to hand, from age to age, from one mind into another across gulfs that seem otherwise impossible. And if today we study a mammoth figurine and see in it the soul of its maker, then one day others will study our carvings, our satellites, our engravings, our symbols, and they will see us, and in that moment we will live again. Not in flesh, but in myth. And perhaps this is our truest immortality. For though we cannot stop death and cannot stop the stars themselves from burning out, we can stop silence. We can defy oblivion by leaving behind stories that echo, that refuse to vanish, that continue to speak long after our voices have been silenced. And it may be that humanity's final destiny is not survival of the body, but survival of the carving. Not continuation of blood, but continuation of meaning. And this possibility transforms the tiny figurines into something far greater than curiosities of prehistory. They become the first steps of an unbroken path stretching out of time. They prove that from the very beginning we have been carving for eternity, carving to leap across death, carving to reach beyond our world, and as we look forward, imagining the moment when humanity etches myths into the dust of Mars or engraves symbols into the frozen oceans of Europa. When we carve into the rings of Saturn or leave stories encoded in the icy heart of comets. When we set monuments on the moon and plant archives on drifting asteroids, we realize that the universe itself is simply another cave wall waiting to be marked, another canvas waiting for the stroke of imagination. And that myth is the flame we carry into it, the firelight that does not die. And when the earth itself one day is swallowed by the sun, when oceans boil away and mountains melt into glowing rivers of stone, when our planet is no more than ash and memory, the myths we carved and sent outward will remain, drifting endlessly, waiting to be found, waiting to be read. And perhaps one day, a being from another world will bend over them and ask the same questions we ask of the figurines. Who were these creatures? What did they believe? Why did they carve? And in that act of wonder, we will endure. Humanity will live again, not as flesh but as story, not as body but as myth. And this is what the figurines tell us. This is why they strike us so deeply, because they are not only voices of the past, but voices of the future. Not only whispers of who we were, but prophecies of who we are becoming. And if we listen carefully, if we let their silence speak, we hear a truth greater than ourselves, that to carve is to resist time, that to shape symbol is to shape eternity, that to create myth is to refuse death. And this is what unites every hand that has ever held a tool against material. From the hunter shaping a lion from ivory, to the scientist engraving a disc for a spacecraft. From the mother telling stories by firelight to the engineer coding archives into light. All of them bound by one endless gesture, the refusal to vanish, the desire to be remembered, the hunger to leave behind a message that says we were here, we dreamed, we made meaning, we sought to endure. And when the stars themselves go dark, if any myth of ours survives, we will still endure. Our voices carried not in lungs but in carvings, not in bodies but in symbols, not in soil but in space, and in this awareness, the tiny carved animals cease to be small. They grow immense. They become the first footsteps of a journey that may stretch across galaxies. They remind us that as long as there are hands and imagination, as long as there is silence to defy and darkness to illuminate, myth will not end. Story will not vanish. Humanity will not be forgotten, because the carvings we leave are the soul we cast into eternity. And so, when our gaze lingers upon the tiny carved animals, when our fingers trace their delicate contours, and our minds lean into the silence they carry across tens of thousands of years, we are not simply observers of artifacts, not simply students of archaeology or wanderers in museums. We are participants in the longest story ever told. For in those carvings we meet the hands of ancestors who first declared that survival alone was not enough, that life must have memory, that existence must carry meaning. And in their fragile creations, we recognize the same unyielding gesture that continues to shape our world today. The refusal to vanish, the insistence that even in the face of death, of silence, of the crushing vastness of time, something of us can endure. Something of us can be carved into the fabric of the world. And as we understand this, we realize that the figurines are not only messages from the past, but seeds of the future. Proof that humanity's truest legacy is not empire or technology or even flesh, but story, for story alone leaps across centuries. Story alone travels farther than our bodies. Story alone carries us into eternity. And whether that story is etched into ivory, painted upon cave walls, whispered around fires, encoded into machines, or hurled into the endless dark aboard ships of steel, it belongs to the same lineage, the same tradition, the same eternal act of carving meaning into silence. And so we see that myth is not fragile, but indestructible, not small, but infinite. For every carving is a bridge across time, every symbol a declaration against death, every story a thread that refuses to break. And though one day our world will crumble, though one day the seas will rise and the mountains fall, though one day even the sun itself will burn out, the myths we have carved will continue to drift, to echo, to whisper. And if there are eyes to see them, if there are minds to wonder at them, then humanity will never have been lost. We will still live in that recognition, in that awe, in that shared breath of meaning. And this is why the tiny carved animals matter, why they stand as the first myths of humanity, because they show us what we are and what we will always be, creatures of imagination, creatures who carve eternity from bone and ivory, from stone and fire, from light and silence. And as long as myth endures, as long as story is told, as long as symbols are left to speak when our voices are gone, we too will endure, not as dust but as memory, not as ashes but as echo, not as flesh but as fire, burning forever in the endless dark, carried forward by the myths we dared to create.